we have just found out that there's something really weird with our activities. When we start our application, so if we run the application, we will see that when it loads the application for the first time, it invokes our method onCreate for the student list activity. But whenever we move to another activity and come back to the previous activity by finishing the second one, it doesn't invoke the onCreate on the first activity. Of course it doesn't. Creation should be run just when the activity is being created. That's what makes sense. It doesn't make sense to create the activity several times if it's created just once. It doesn't make sense. So now it was created, and if I go to another activity and come back to my activity, it doesn't create the activity again. It just shows the activity again. How does it happen? I mean, when is it going to be invoked, the onCreate, and when it's not going to be invoked? What is going to be invoked whenever you come back to your activity? What is going on? What can I do? So let's take a look at the life cycle of our activities. Let's go to the Android documentation. If you Google for the developer Android documentation on the activity class, you'll find the activity documentation, which starts as a common Java doc, traditional Java doc. And if you go a little bit further, you see the activity lifecycle, and that's what I'm interested in. You see that when an activity is launched, so the object is first instantiated. Of course the object is instantiated, otherwise you couldn't invoke its methods. So you instantiated the activity, and that's what happens when we run our application for the first time. It instantiates our launchable activity, the main activity, which is the list activity that has been instantiated. So after it has been launched, it invokes the onCreate method, which means I'm creating your activity. So it's created. So our code is run and the data is loaded, and the adapter displays that information into our view, and our activity is shown, is displayed to us. Perfect. Then it invokes the onStart method, then it invokes the onResume method, and then your activity is finally running. So now my activity is running. I can click, I can double click, I can point, I can do whatever I want. So I want to go to another activity. So if I click on something that displays another activity here, anything that displays another activity on top of my activity, it goes into on pause mode. So it means that it's pausing my current activity to display another activity. But notice, the onPause method is called whatever activity is going to be displayed on top of mine. So if an activity is displayed in the half of the screen, for example, just here, if we do some code that displays another activity just on half of my screen, just on this half here, onPause is going to be invoked. So it invokes the onPause method. As we have the onCreate, we could override the onStart, we could override the onResume, and we could override the onPause. So what is it doing? It's telling our application, it's telling our activity, oh come on, there's something going on top of you. Do you want to do something? If you want, do better now, because he's going to play, your user is going to play with another activity which might be partially on top of your activity. So then you can do something on the onPause method. And then if the user closes that half screen activity, it goes back to your activity and it invokes the onResume method of your activity, and you start running your activity again. So the resume, onResume, and onPause methods, are events that are called, methods that are invoked to let me, developer, do something when the user goes to another activity that covers half of my screen or part of my screen, and the user goes back to my activity. So that's a good point. The onResume point seems to be a good point, because I could implement here the load the information. But notice that I keep saying half of the screen, half of the screen, half of the screen. Why half of the screen? Our case is not half of the screen. Whenever we click here, we are displaying a completely different activity in the whole screen, in the whole view, in the full view. So it calls onPause, and it also invokes onStop. If your activity stops being visible, and it's not visible, take a look. Which activity is being visible now? Just the form activity is visible now. So the old list, the list of students list activity is not viewable. If it's not viewable, it means the onStop method was invoked. it gave my activity some time to do something important. Because the end user might never return here. It might just go to another activity and that's it. He might never return to my screen. So if there's some temporary data that I want to save, if there's something I want to do, I better do now, because I have no idea what is going to happen next. And when the user closes this activity here and goes back to my activity, then it comes here and invokes the onRestart method of our application, onRestart, and then gives me back the chance to do whatever I want. Okay, now it's your turn, and then I can do whatever I want. Then it invokes the onStart, then it invokes the onResume, and then my activity is running again. So notice that the life cycle of several activities are completely different from each other. We have two activities running in our system at some point in time. In the beginning, we have just this activity here, and it's launched, it invokes the onCreate, onStart, onResume, and it's running. Whenever we click here, we have a second activity going on. But before the second activity runs, and it's running state, it pauses our activity, it instantiates the second activity, creates the second activity, it's going to start, resume, and run the second activity, the second one, the form. But the list activity, the list activity is now stopped. It stops the list activity because this activity is filling the entire screen. So it stops the first activity and the second activity is now running. So whenever I click back from here, then the second activity goes to onPause, goes to onStop, goes to onDestroy, and the second activity is completely destroyed. Now it goes back to the first activity, which was on the stop mode, and it goes and runs the onRestart, onStart, onResume, and now it's running again. So it seems like it doesn't matter if it's half screen or full screen. OnResume is going to be called whenever I come back to my activity. That's what I want to do. Whenever I come back to my activity, I want to reload the data from the database. I want to execute the onResume method doing something, and that's what I'm going to do.